Hello and welcome back. Now, this is lecture number 25, the last lecture of the fifth week. And as you know, this week we are focusing on public health. We are trying to understand the emergence and growth of public health at global level, then in Indian context, and then we are trying to identify the important components of public health and dimensions of public health and also the agencies in Indian context. And then we are trying to understand some of the specific components at length. So we try to understand uh, the sanitation aspect, then food and drinking water aspect, right? So we have developed a broader understanding about the components of sanitation. Yes, of course, there are many other, as we discussed in one of the lectures, that there are several possible dimensions and there are many agencies which actually take care of the public health issue. But we cannot talk about all those things at length because we have the time constant and we have to stick to the structured curriculum, right? So now in this lecture, basically the title of today's lecture is Epidemiology and Social Epidemiology, right? So, many among you might not have heard the term epidemiology, but you can relate it with the term epidemic, right? So, epidemiology is related to epidemics. We'll talk about the definition of epidemiology and the context also in which basically this concept has emerged. But before we begin, let me talk about the important concepts that we have covered in this lecture, right? So, epidemiology, then epidemic and pandemic, then some of the communicable disease, and basically their prevalence. So when we talk about epidemic and pandemic, we talked about that earlier also, but we will focus on something which is related to the epidemiological framework, right? Then functions of epidemiology, and then we will talk about exclusive branch which has emerged and emerging fast, and that is social epidemiology. So after hearing this lecture, you will get an idea that what this epidemiology is and what is this social epidemiology and why do we need that. So first, have a basic understanding on this. Epidemiology primarily refers to the study of the causes, distribution, and determinants of disease and injuries, right? So the causes and distribution. Now, distribution is very important, right? Because when we talk about the prevalence of a disease, then till now we have been looking at disease from the perspective of the individuals, right? That certain number of individuals are getting affected by that. But the disease is spread over a larger area, right? So there is a distribution and there is a pattern in that distribution. So there are several other things which are related with that distribution and that pattern, right? So when we try to understand the causation, but along with that, we also try to understand the distribution. For that matter, in one particular locality, one type of disease is prevailing at one point of time, but over a period of time, we get to know that the spread of the disease has increased, the distribution has increased, and then over a period of time, we get to know that that has further increased, and the number of people who are getting affected by that has increased exponentially. And this is what? This is how the epidemics come into existence, right? So this distribution and spread is something which is making a particular type of disease basically of an epidemic, right? But what is very important here that when we talk about this kind of a spread, then primarily we are talking about the communicable disease, and communicable disease by definition are the disease which communicate from one person to another person, of course through certain agents or vectors. We talked about these things in one of the previous lectures where we talked about definition and concepts related to disease also. So this is epidemiology, and it also talks about the ways of controlling the spread, because Identifying the spread or the distribution is only one dimension. The other dimension is how can we contain or control that spread in human population, and that is even more important, right? Because containing an epidemic is the first requirement, right? Recently, we have seen COVID, and we all are aware of these things, right? So we will see these things again. The goal of epidemiology is to limit disease. Of course, limiting it is one important thing, and injury and death due to that, right? So the first goal would be to limit. Cure, we have not mentioned. You need to understand the difference between this epidemiology and the biomedical approach, or basically the curative approach. The curative approach is talking about cure or prevention. But what we are talking about here is to limit the spread, because at first stage we need to contain so that it should not spread, right? So that is what is epidemiology is. Discipline of epidemiology is primarily concerned with the environmental factors. Why? Because we are talking about primarily the communicable disease. Now, whether that is physical or biological or chemical or psychological and social, that means the environmental factors will take into consideration all these possibles. So, when we talk about epidemiology, we talk about spread of the disease, measuring that, having some kind of statistics about it, and then also talking about how to limit that or contain that. And we will take into consideration all the external factors generally identified as the environmental factors, which may include the physical, biological, chemical, psychological, and social, and all these things, right? So these are the things that we generally study in epidemiology. Now, why do we need to study epidemiology? That is a very important question. And for this, basically, we need to go back to the slides that we visited earlier also, when we were talking about the emergence of and growth of public health, right? At that time, we saw how there were certain epidemics and pandemics right from the beginning of human civilization. And those challenges basically created the scenario in which public health developed. So when we talked about the growth and development of public health, then this is one very important component of that growth of epidemiology. Because epidemiologists help us to understand the distribution, the spread. Now, here in this slide, I want to seek your attention towards the estimated death toll. How do we get to know these numbers basically? These are certainly estimations that I have mentioned also, that this data may be tentative as provided by open access website, right? But it's not about that. How do we get to know those numbers? Because here the numbers are mentioned for some of those epidemics which happened long back, thousands of years before also, right? So the epidemiologists basically have their own ways and tools and techniques to make these pattern, to understand these numbers, right? And this is just an example of what is epidemiology, or how it is making some kind of help in understanding public health. And as we have stated, when there is a communicable disease, when there is a epidemic like situation, or when the epidemic becomes global, that is what is identified as pandemic, then the first task is to contain that, to limit that. And for that, basically, we need the services of the epidemiologist, because understanding would be the first requirement to settle or solve that problem. And we can see in these slides that there are different types of communicable disease which have caused all those epidemics, right? So you can see that there was the problem of influenza, then the problem of plague, then smallpox, then again plague, smallpox, again plague. Plague basically has killed millions of people. then cholera, typhoid, then again cholera, then influenza. Now you can see that the diseases are repeating themselves. Now that is very strange when you see at this point of time historically. But those things were happening like that only. Why? Because there was no solution at that point of time. Some of these diseases became controllable only with the interventions created by the modern medicine. But even here, the spread is actually the biggest problem, right? So hope you got an idea. Then in the this 20th century itself, we see that there are diseases like influenza, typhus, again H1N1, H2N2, and then most recently COVID, and before that HIV/AIDS. So HIV/AIDS was different from most of these diseases in the sense that it was primarily a sexually transmissible disease, but it was also spreading through injections because the blood was getting contaminated, or sometimes also genetically, right? But primarily the sexual contact is responsible for the spread of that. That means there are different types of problem, and epidemiologists help us to understand those different situations. Then this is another slide. We have seen this one also before, and here I have used it so that you get an idea about how do we get these specific numbers, because this slide is full of numbers. Now there are different types of disease, right? And then there are different groups of people or groups of states, right? And then there is a kind of classification. So this classification in itself is one of the contributions of the epidemiologist, right? And then getting these numbers, estimating these numbers, and projection of these numbers is again one of the important responsibility of the epidemiologist, right? So through these slides, which we had already seen and had an understanding, now we can understand the role of epidemiology and what kind of work basically epidemiologists are doing, right? So now we are moving further. Now let us have a very brief understanding about how did it emerge, because epidemics were there since the beginning of human civilization. So the effort to contain those was also there since the beginning of human civilization. And we will talk about Hippocrates. We have been talking about Hippocrates, right? So Hippocrates, way back 400 BC, attempted to explain disease occurrence from a rational instead of supernatural viewpoint. Now, why do we talk about Hippocrates time and again? Because at that point of time, basically, most of the explanations were coming from religious perspective or theological perspective, which were actually supernatural or divine factors were considered important. Now, Hippocrates tried to understand those in a rational way, right? He tried to understand the real causes behind those things, differing from the viewpoints of the religious people. So, Hippocrates talked about a good number of environmental factors as well as the host factors, and how these could have caused or influenced the development of the disease and simultaneously the spread of the disease. So talking about Hippocrates makes sense here. Then some of the very critical and very realistic contribution came from the works of John Grant and then William Farr. Grant was the first to quantify patterns of birth, death, and disease occurrence, noting male and female disparity, high infant mortality, etc. So the way we look at the figures, prevalence in terms of age, in terms of gender, then several other categories. So Grant basically initiated that kind of classification sort of thing. So that is considered very important, a landmark in the growth of epidemiology. Then very recently we have the contribution of William Farr in 19th century, right? And he was a British epidemiologist in 1850s and 60s and 70s, basically he was observing what was happening in England, right? And then with the application of the statistical understanding that he had, he tried to understand and classify and categorize the various information that was uh, collected and presented by Fa. Now, after having a brief understanding, we got an idea that epidemiology primarily developed by the uh, third quarter of the 19th century. That was the time when public health was emerging. We have been talking about that. So, when public health as a discipline was emerging, then epidemiology as an approach was also emerging, because the statistics, the information that public health experts were getting, those were basically compiled by these epidemiologists. So as of now, in contemporary context, we can talk about the functions of epidemiology. Epidemiology has matured and it is contributing in a meaningful way. Now, an American public health physician, Milton Terrace, has summarized the functions of epidemiology, right? So we can think of so many functions, but I have included here few important so that we can get an idea. What are the important functions? First, discover the agent, host, and environmental factors that affect causation and prevention. So, three important things are mentioned here: agent, host, and the environmental factors. Now, agent basically which are responsible for carrying the vectors basically from one person to another person, right? If we are talking about a communicable disease, and if we have successfully identified the agent, then we can contain that, if we can address the problem of the agent, right? But if that is not known, then the problem will remain there. Then the second important factor is the host, right? Because many of these agents or vectors, which could be virus, which could be bacteria, which could be any other microorganism, they find certain host where they stay, right, and grow. So if you can identify the host, that will again become very productive, because then we can address the problem, right, at the level of the host also. And then basically these agents or those carriers or those microorganisms, whichever thing is causing that, they survive under certain environmental conditions. We are talking about dengue. Everybody is aware of dengue. No, that there is a specific kind of mosquito. Now, in which situation the dengue mosquito is basically growing. If you can understand that and if you can address that problem, then we can get rid of the problem of the dengue, right? But we need to understand all these important aspects related to that. So this was basically identified as one of the core functions of epidemiology. And next to this, identify those sections of the population that have the greatest risk from a specific cause of ill health. Now, we have been talking about the thing from the causation perspective. Now, the second important thing or the other aspect of this problem is this, that who is getting affected by these communicable disease, or who have the vulnerability of getting affected by that. So if you are talking about malaria, now again it is spread because of a mosquito, or for that matter dengue. Then people who are living in the surroundings where there is a possibility of growth of those mosquitoes and survival of those mosquitoes will be naturally having more possibility, threat, or vulnerability of getting affected by that. So that is another very important factor. So who could get affected by that? Identifying that, the different sections of the population, and then certainly the localities. Now we can keep on talking about these things. There is another important aspect, that is who will get affected by those diseases, under which circumstances, which group of people will get worse affected by that, right? These are all related aspects. So all these things basically we can try to understand. Then evaluate the effectiveness of preventive and therapeutic health programs. Now we have been talking about preventive care, right, and therapeutic care. So to what extent these are effective? Now, an important thing I can talk about here, that very often we are making use of certain medicines to control the effects caused by certain problems, disease. For example, let's talk about malaria. Now, we are having certain mechanisms for getting cured, but do we have any preventive mechanism? That would be a very important thing. For example, we fought the war against polio. So, at that level, we had those preventive mechanisms, right? Now, recently we witnessed COVID. Do we have any preventive mechanism for that? Very often we say that the immune system in itself is a very strong system or mechanism. But does the immune system give you enough protection? So these are several important interrelated scientific related to medical science also factors which help us to understand the effectiveness of certain provisions, and basically an evaluation is required, and epidemiology basically helps in making that kind of academic research and understanding also. Then natural history of disease, that is very important. Very often the vectors basically which cause the disease become develop certain kind of resistance, right? So certain disease or certain problems become uh, rich to that kind of condition that certain medicines are no more effective on that. So there are drug resistant type of problems. You might have heard about the drug resistant malaria or drug resistant tuberculosis. That means those medicines are not in that position to cure that kind of problem. So how do these things actually happen? These things need to be examined at several levels, and epidemiology basically helping these things because they provide the data. They provide the authentic data that is at the core of all these types of research. Then investigate outbreak to identify their source. Now, outbreak and identification of outbreak is very important. If statisticians, epidemiologists, medical practitioners, or for that matter, any category of professional, if they can predict the outbreak of any epidemic, then the problem could be solved at the initial stage. But the problem is this, that the outbreak cannot be identified so easily, right? However, there is an effort which is being made by this approach also, epidemiology, to understand all these things. That way we can see that there are several very important functions of epidemiology. Now within epidemiology, actually several approaches have developed and are developing. Sometimes we can identify clinical epidemiology or medical epidemiology or several other types of epidemiology. Now one important basically offshoot of that or branch emerging within that is social epidemiology, right? Now this is having some kind of differences from the conventional approach which is followed in epidemiology, and so we need to talk about this also. According to Thomas, social epidemiology is the branch of epidemiology that deals with the social distribution of disease and the social determinants of health and illness. So social distribution is very important. We have been talking about distribution. till now, but we have not discussed the issue from the social distribution perspective. Now, what is social distribution? So, talking about basically the age structure or the sex composition. Now, these are the demographic factors. These are very important. But the demographics also get affected by the social background. So, understanding about the biological classification or categories is one aspect of the problem. And locating those biological categories within the larger social framework is another requirement. Because when we try to identify people, we have to identify them in terms of where they are actually located or in terms of their social location. Then only we can have an effective preventive mechanism. So identifying the social location means we need to understand the social distribution and the social determinants, right? And here social epidemiology is coming into existence. So now you can relate whatever we have been discussing in the initial lectures. We have been talking about the social determinants of health, the social determinants of disease, the social determinants of sometimes even medicine also, right? But the social determinants of illness and disease are very important because social epidemiology is actually getting benefited by that. The field incorporates the concepts and methods of good number of social sciences like sociology, psychology, political science, economics, demography, geography, and even biology. Right? So the comprehensive effort made by all these social sciences have created this specific understanding on distribution of disease, which we identify as social distribution, and some of the determinants that we identify as social determinants. Social epidemiologists examine the origin and spread of various health conditions, the way in which health is tied to different social factors. For example, poverty, right? We have seen these figures here. Now, these figures give you an idea that somehow the economic conditioning of the states and the people is very important for understanding the spread of the disease, right? EAG states, as I have mentioned in this slide, are the empowered action group states, right, where they are lacking behind in some of the important social determinants, right? Socio-economically backward states these are. So the problem of these disease is prevailing more in those states which are actually socio-economically more backward. That means we need to take into consideration these social factors, social backgrounds. And then education is something which is very important. We have always been talking about prevention, but education is very instrumental in creating the kind of mindset, the capability, and exposing to the kind of research which is very often required for maintaining this kind of thing. So, whether it is income or it is occupation. Now, occupation in Indian context is very important because most of the employments in India are actually located in the unorganized sector, right? So, within the unorganized sector, the work conditions are very different from the organized sector. So, those people who are working in not appropriate work condition, they are more vulnerable to certain types of disease, certain types of problems, and so they are more vulnerable, susceptible, right? So this kind of understanding is coming when we apply this social epidemiological approach. And because sociology is one of the important discipline which contribute in the understanding of social epidemiology, that is why we are basically talking about this paper. That is why we are studying this paper on sociology of health, because we have developed our own understanding on prevalence of disease. Then we have understood that how social factors are playing a very important role in causation of disease, then in facilitating certain conditions or in mitigating certain conditions in which those diseases prevail. And we are also talking about how these social factors are playing very important role in basically making use of the medicine and all these things, right? So only thing that I wanted to talk about here is this, that this social epidemiology approach is again adding a new dimension in the understanding of epidemiology. People are not created equal, some kind of inequality is prevailing. And when we have a society where there is a structural inequality already prevailing, then any other kind of inequality is actually compounding that sort of inequality. So we have the economic inequality, we have the sometimes caste related or the social inequalities, then we are having several other types of deprivations and inequality. Now within that, this health inequalities are also very problematic. Amartya Sen has written a lot about these aspects related to health and spread of disease. So we will talk about the health inequalities in other lectures also, but social epidemiology is an effort to understand all these social determinants and factors, right? So that way, this is again doing a very important role in understanding public health and it making public health to come within the access of people at large, so that collectively we can achieve the larger goal of health for all. So there are a few other things related to social epidemiology. I mentioned this slide, and this is, I think, self-explanatory. You can understand that. And these are some of the references that we have used, right? So with this, we come to an end of not only this lecture, but also the topic that we have started to discuss in this week, which is public health. So we will meet in the next lecture, but there we will begin our course for the 6th week. Till then, take care.